Today we're going to talk about some of the gaps in current biological theory and how a physics model can help bridge some of those gaps. So for instance, we're going to cover such things as bonding, temperature control, genetic theory, and also how the nervous system works. So Peter, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about what the current biological theory says about bonding.
Well, in current biological theory, and in fact biological theory has been about the same for 60 or 70 years, and bonds are considered to be the source of energy. In fact, the bond theory has replaced the old idea of a field theory of biology. So what we're left with is a bond theory of biology. And then when you try and investigate what bonds really are, they say that they're energy. So it has a lot of similarities to the field theory, but of course it's called something else. It looks to me, from a quick look, that the bond theory comes from a basic idea in physics, from Coulomb's law, which is about charge. All right, and the charge has to be in a specific location. And when you get that, you've got a bond. We get interatomic bonds, and they seem to be incredibly important so far as adding up the amount of energy you get in and out of a system.
So when you say a bond is actually energy, what exactly do you mean by that?
Everything in this world is just pure energy, and the physicist tries to describe what the energy is and what rules it obeys. And this is energy that obeys Coulomb's law of charge.
So in current biological theory, bonding helps explain things such as osmosis and diffusion and catalysts.
It's used very much so far as the idea of creation of heat goes in the body. The bonds have to be broken and remade, and there has to be something pushing that. And this is a process of hydrolysis of ATP, adenosine triphosphate. So ATP becomes terribly important as something that's, as it were, almost storing bond energy and helping it to release at a certain time. This is the origin of heat in the body. So bond energy, by biologists, eventually gets transferred into calories. Everybody's heard of calories. They haven't heard of bonds. There is a mathematical relationship between bond energy and calories that biologists have worked out.
And why are you a little bit unhappy about their current bond theory and how that applies to temperature control and heat generation?
I'm not entirely unhappy about bond theory, except that I did an experiment. You know, with all our idea of applying physics to biology, we want biology and physics to basically agree. And I found out that when I tested ATP, that it would not talk to hydrogen, it would not talk to hydrogen bonds. It wouldn't match, in other words. And I tried in about 1995, and I tried again in about 2005. And I even tried other things like ATPase, which is the enzyme related to ATP. I couldn't get a match to happen. I thought there's something wrong here. There's something wrong here about the way in which the body energy is regulated. I'm not saying I have a problem with bonds, but there's more to the story.
Why does it matter that hydrogen doesn't match with ATP?
Well, it should. According to the biological theory, we've got, in order for a chemical system to work, the energetic system has to work. And on this occasion, it doesn't. And so I thought there must be something wrong with my experiment, but there could be something wrong with our concepts.
So you're saying that ATP isn't actually responsible for generating heat in the body?
Well, according to my experiments, it can't be, but the hydrogen bond can be. But the relationship between hydrogen and ATP is not at all clear from the experiment I did.
As we're using a different model of bonding, how does this affect such things as diffusion and catalysts and hemodynamics?
It has a huge effect on the basic ideas of biology. One of these is, of course, what happens when something goes into solution. We're talking about diffusion. If you put a chemical into solution, and don't stir it, don't do anything, just place it in. Gradually, the atoms of that chemical will diffuse equally through the whole solution. Now, if we've got our hard-edged idea of the molecule minding its own business, there is no reason why it should do this. It should just sit there. So some interesting process goes on when something goes into solution, and that's called diffusion.
And what effect does that have in biology?
Well, extraordinary effects. When you poison the roots of a tree, it will, if you put it on the root here, it will appear in every leaf right at the top of the tree a very, very short time later.
Minutes,
It's almost
hours?
in a few seconds, it'll go from the root to the highest leaf of the tree.
And there's no way that could be via a chemical messenger
Well, the
system.
chemical idea of osmosis would be a little bit slower because of the number of membranes that it has to pass through to get there, through billions of cells.
And it's pretty much instantaneous.
It seems to be. There have been experiments done showing it's almost instantaneous, which doesn't fit with the model of biology, where we have osmosis, which is a special case of diffusion. What happens is we have around every cell, we've got a nuclear membrane around the nucleus, we've got another membrane around the cell itself. The cell is just a bag of water. That was the old idea of the model. Now the problem is that the solutions inside and outside the cell aren't the same. There's potassium on one side and more of a concentration of sodium on the other. So it became a problem to say, how does the sodium know to go to that side of the membrane and the potassium knows to go to that side? And we just don't know. It is quite a big problem. And this has been looked at by revolutionary biologists, cell biologists like Ling and others, to try and explain, trying to get up a model as to how this could occur. And there are hundreds of different chemicals going in a direction, inside and outside the cell.
And they say it's from these spurious channels through the cells.
Well, there are supposed to be channels inside the cell membrane, and of course they look with a microscope.
They don't find any.
None there. Then they put up another theory, there's something else. This has been going on since it was originally they became aware of it a long time ago.
What's the latest theory of how
there aren't
osmosis
any
works?
theories. The theory is that of osmosis, that there are charged particles and that they're going there and that the other ones go there. There isn't really a satisfactory theory that's very pleasing. And we have to answer it ourselves if we're putting up a field model to say, well, why does sodium want to go that way through the membrane and potassium goes the other way? And of course there are many, many other chemicals that do the same thing.
And what's your explanation?
I don't have an explanation at all. I'm just saying that there's such a thing as structure in space, and that there's a structure of each part of each chemical, of each molecule, and it may be structurally related. When you start to talk about holograms, we're talking structure in space, which eventually you say, what's that? It comes down to charge in space. And the charge is arranged in a particular formation. That may indeed be the secret to how osmosis through the cell wall works.
Let's talk about catalysts.
Catalysts are very interesting because we're all used to this idea of molecule A and molecule B, and they get in a certain configuration, and then they have to actually physically touch, and then bingo, we get a reaction. When there's a catalyst, there's something there that stops chemical reactions from happening until they reach a certain energy level. Otherwise, the whole world would sort of fizz a little bit too much. You see what I mean? So there has to be something stopping chemical reactions, and then there has to be something that initiates it. Otherwise, everything would be reacting much too quickly, and we'd all be too hot. You see what I mean? And this has all been investigated satisfactorily, and we have some explanations for it.
What are their explanations?
The explanation is that to speed a chemical reaction up, it has to be in the presence of another chemical, which doesn't take part in that reaction at all. In other words, it's about energy. And whatever you do in biology, you always get away from the molecular thing and you're coming back to saying what is really controlling it is energy. And this happens with catalysts too.
And what controls energy is really fields.
Well, certainly once we look at where is there any spare energy in the system and how does that spare energy behave, we do get to quantum physics. Whereas we jump energy levels from one to another, then at a certain energy level, the chemical reaction starts. Once it's stopped happening, the energy level drops, it switches off the chemical reaction. So this is the nitty-gritty. We've got to get to that nitty-gritty to explain a field theory of biology.
So the actual nitty-gritty is what is actually controlling chemical reactions in the body is an overall big body field acting as the master control system.
Yeah, but within that we've got hormones, enzymes and catalysts, all part of a chemical control system. But at a certain point we leave the chemical control system and we go into another idea. So we're saying we just want
as a suprachemical control.
Suprachemical control. We're adding something on to biology. We're not saying it's all wrong. I'm saying, well, it could work better if we thought about it in a more fluid way, yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about the second law of thermodynamics. Why do humans only obey it when they're dead?
Yeah, so I put that in some writing and you've picked it up. And yeah, when you die, the heat in your body dissipates and your corpse becomes the same temperature as the surrounding atmosphere. That's what the second law of thermodynamics is about. It's about everything reaching the same temperature over a period of time. Now, when we're alive, we do exactly the opposite. We concentrate heat energy in our bodies. Now, if the second law of thermodynamics was really working, our fingers and toes and nose and ears would always be a lot colder than the centre of the body. To a point this is so, but our body temperature is regulated to within 1 degree during the summer, during the winter, during windstorms, rain, snow, and so on. This to me is quite an extraordinary occurrence. And it's a bit hard to explain with the model using hydrogen bonds and breaking up carbohydrates as the sole source of heat.
So I mean, normally current biological theory, it says that it's sort of controlled by metabolic rate, which in turn is controlled by enzymes, which is in turn controlled by genes.
Yeah. The whole idea of biology as developed since 1940 has this pretty clear model, which you've just stated, that there is a gene, there is an enzyme, and there is a specific thing happening in the cell, and there is a direct relationship between each gene to each enzyme to each function in the cell. That is why there's such a stress these days on genetics. The only trouble is that they don't seem to be able to use genetics to heal people.
Perhaps you could tell us a bit how they haven't found any evidence of a master control gene for actually controlling all these enzyme functions.
Yeah, well, of course, the biologists and the geneticists understand that there has to be a big picture of control because the genes they're looking at are enzyme controllers, that is, controlling individual activities inside a very tiny cell. What about control of the whole body temperature? That is a master control thing, and they have proposed that there are master control genes that do just that.
But have they found any?
Haven't been found to date.
Perhaps we'll have a look at the alternative explanation. How can a field explanation explain how we can control temperature perfectly in the body?
Yeah, well, you have to have a field that works autocephalously, that it is inherent in what it does. It does what it does because of what it is. It's not an intelligent thing, it just happens. So the first thing we would require for body temperature control, for each finger, for each toe, and for all the little promontories, to keep the exact temperature night and day and so on, it's quite difficult, but it does mean that every cell in the body has to know what every other cell is doing. If there is a cell which is becoming too cold, something has to be done inside that cell to bring it up to the temperature. So each cell is making its own energy in relation to all the other cells in the body. It's quite a tall order. The biochemists and molecular scientists have only taken from physics what they want. Instead of the physics being the major control system over chemistry, they've sort of gone off on their own to get their own ideas to work conceptually, because it was very, very difficult stuff. And to do that, they built this model of the atom called the hard-edged model, which is as if the molecule is like a little hard-edged crystal. And it's got a boundary, okay? And now once we've got little boundaries, they can't talk to each other. And so they understood that there was a need for some communication between molecules and atoms. Otherwise we couldn't ever have communication. We couldn't ever have a reaction. So it was necessary to get a little bit of fluidity. So they said, oh, well, sometimes an electron leaves its so-called orbits, which is nonsense, there are no orbits, or leave a shell, which is just a theory, and suddenly it breaks all the so-called bonds, which are supposed to be holding it in place, and goes and wanders off, and apparently returns to the same atom. And this is preposterous. And as you can see, we've overcome that whole problem about how a chemical knows what else is out there to react with by the Wolf model of having standing waves in space that are always there.
So perhaps just explain a little bit about the Wolf model.
The Wolf model isn't hard-edged. We've got a dual centre of the electron, which can be in the same place, or when energised moves a little apart, and it's surrounded by spherical standing waves. And we're saying in the Wolf model that we can have bonds, because it's the phase relationship between these big standing waves in space that makes our bonds. So we get down to phase relationships.
So what you're saying, now all the molecules in the body are able to know what all the other molecules in the body are doing because of this Wolf explanation.
Strictly speaking, according to the Wolf idea, every atom in the universe knows what every other atom is doing, which is a mind-boggling idea.
But that helps set up a master control system.
That is the basis of a master control system, because in between every atom in the universe we have a structure. Lovely stuff.
Okay, let's take a look at some of the examples of why biological theory can't explain information transfer via chemical messages. So, for instance, we've got, well, perhaps you could tell us about the story about human birth being induced with acupuncture needles.
That's a problematic one. That was my specialist area years ago when I was teaching acupuncture. The point for induction of birth is in fact in the nail bed of your little toe. And oxytocin is produced as a result of a hormone in your head. So a message has to go from your little toe to your head, production of oxytocin, back to the
womb
to get it to relax sufficiently for the birth to occur. Okay, it's a muscle relaxant, that's all. And what you do is you get hold of the little toe, you put a needle in it, and keep on manipulating the needle. About 20 minutes later, there's a surge of oxytocin produced by the body. Now, it's only at that one specific point. And what occurs to me straight away is that we've just happened to get to a point on the hologram that's got a direct pathway through to the hologram for oxytocin production somewhere else in the body, because we just call that an acupuncture meridian. Now, if you use the biological model, you have to get it, that message has to be carried by the nervous system up here. We have to get from nervous system to hormonal system. You know, it's a much more complex and difficult model than the field model that we're proposing.
Does it actually start producing oxytocin instantly?
No, that's
Takes
the
20
interesting thing. Why should it take 20 minutes? And the same with open heart surgery using acupuncture anesthesia, which caused a lot of interest. The point for open heart surgery is a point called Ne-Guan, inner gate, which is about there between two tendons in the forearm. It's not particularly near any major nerve that goes near the heart. Everybody has this idea that we're blocking nerve pathways to create anesthesia. In acupuncture anesthesia, this does not occur because after 20 minutes of what is called strong stimulation, or even electrical stimulation of that point, something happens in the brain that causes the heart to cease to have any feeling. But it still takes 20 minutes. So we know that there's a cycle that goes on in the body field that's a 10-minute, 20-minute cycle.
But why are you sure that that couldn't be a chemical messenger?
Obviously chemistry is involved. You can't have one without the other. But we're saying we want a chemical model as far as it will go, and when it won't go any further, we have to say there is another model that could be taking over.
But which is the part where it has to take over?
There is no clear explanation as far as chemistry goes about why we have to use this particular point and why it takes 20 minutes to cause acupuncture anesthesia of the heart and chest. It is just not clear what is going on. You will always find a chemical molecular explanation, but is it a good one?
Let's move on to embryology and why a fetus actually, its heart actually starts beating before it even has a nervous system, and even while it's still using its mother's blood.
Yes, well, the first thing that occurs in the egg after it begins to form something that looks remotely like a structure is you get a sort of a primitive loop for the brain. Then you get brain and the notochord as the primitive spine. And then this little heart occurs, just a little blob. And then after about 40 days, it begins to beat. There's absolutely no need for it because the fetus is getting the mother's blood. And so why would it, nature doesn't use up energy for no reason. There has to be reason. And of course, if every cell has to know what every other cell is doing, there has to be a mechanism, there has to be a recording studio for that organism. And so we're looking at the heart as an imprinter of information for the field, without which it simply can't grow past those first 40 days.
I mean, there's another good example of information transfer theory where you've got fishes swimming through the sea like a huge shoal of thousands of pounds of fishes, then it sees a shark and it suddenly instantaneously forms into a ball, and all of them are only about 3 centimetres apart, and they all do it at exactly the same time. They can all swim in exactly the same direction. And there's obviously no way how a fish 20 metres or 100 metres even on the left-hand side of the shoal and the fish right down the right-hand side, how would they know that that one's turning and the other one's turning?
Well, if you think they're in a spherical ball, they've all got to go at a different speed and they've all got to go in a different direction. And if they're going to form a ball, which the idea of which is to frighten off the shark, and of course you've seen this on the TV series by David Attenborough, which is just astounding, and you're so amazed that it's happening. You don't sit back and think, well, how could that possibly happen? How do they communicate with each other so that all the fish know what to do and where to go?
Well, not only that, it happens at exactly the same instant in time. There's no time delay.
That's right, it's insane. And what we're saying, with our model, we can get spherical balls in space because all you need is a message. So we've got a spherical structure.
So all these little fishes have a picture of that hologram of the spherical ball in their tiny brains, and because they can all instantly communicate, they are able to form that wall.
Yeah, but I mean, we've got this idea about the nervous system being wires in the body with little switches. No, no, no. It's ideational. We've got this capacity to visualize and picture things and work from that. And to do that, you've got to have this spatial structure.
The same's true of butterflies. I mean, you get butterflies when they're trying to mate,
Yeah.
supposedly trying to find each other across a valley of, I don't know, tens and tens of miles, and it's meant to detect it under the chemical system of so-called
Pheromones.
Pheromones.
Yeah.
And there's no way a little molecule of a pheromone here could be detected 10 miles away by another butterfly. I mean, it's a physical impossibility.
Well, it's a theory that was put up, but you can see that the theory falls apart with distance, and because the pheromone becomes so rarefied, there are only a few molecules of it there.
Unless, of course, they believed in homeopathy, and then it would work for them.
Oh. We don't need to invoke homeopathy. We only need to say that each of these molecules, which are there, I mean, you can find pheromones. We actually know that they're there. It's fine. But how does it transmit its message saying that it's there? And here we come to a really important point. In biology, things can only happen when molecules rub together. Whereas if you take the wolf model, they don't actually have to collide. There's this thing about the particles of the atoms have to collide for a reaction to take place. Well, eventually they do, yes. But there's that idea of knowing where the molecule is. And of course, biologists came up with all these things about orientation in space and reaction ideas, and they could only take place at a certain angle. That's all fine because we've got our idea of the bonds and the phase angles and everything as well. So you can see we've got a lot in common, but I think using our model of the atom, which is not hard-edged, actually solves a lot of insoluble problems for the biologists.
Well, I mean, it's a lovely example that I think we discovered when I was in Thailand with you a few years ago. And we were in a boat, and you could do the same in a car if you put your head outside a car window. But I was at the top end of a boat. The boat was zooming along at about 20 or 30 miles per hour, and the boat just stank of fuel. Not of fuel, of all the fumes.
Diesel.
Yeah, I could smell it right at the front of the boat, right on the tip of the boat, with a 30 mile per hour headwind. And how on earth could that be possible if it was from chemical messages? It couldn't. But it's obviously possible because the sound, if you like, it's just carrying quantum information on the sound waves to my nose.
The
sound wave
carries, the sound wave of electromagnetic carries, light carries. Yeah.
But I mean, the reason I was saying it is anybody can test this out just by getting in a smelly car, sticking your head out the window when you're going 60 miles per hour, and you'll still be able to smell the fumes that are coming out of the exhaust pipe in the back. And there's no way any chemicals are going from that against a 60 mile per hour wind up to your nose.
Yeah.
It couldn't happen. And it's easy proof that there must be another explanation.
Well, if you look at the physicists, even a great physicist like Richard Feynman, he candidly admits that we can't really explain very much about the world at all. I mean, there's a certain amount of humility there, and here biologists go and make up these theories that work a bit but eventually fall to pieces. And what I'm trying to do is not confront biology, but simply to point out it would be better if you would just loosen up a bit and look at the possibilities of taking a new model from physics. And the new model from physics has grown considerably since 1984.
And biology has never caught up.
Biology's never caught up.
Let's take a quite a detailed look at the nervous system in that it could act as a sort of quantum hologram carrier of information.
Yeah.
But we better start with all the faults. So let's have a look at the nerve transmission speeds.
Well, the nerve transmission speeds vary so much. I always like to think of Nureyev doing a ballet dance because he's got this picture in his head and it's turning into a picture in his body. Now that to me is quite a miracle if we're going to have impulses travelling along wires. It wouldn't be possible, all right, because it's three-dimensional space and he's positioning himself and defying gravity and trying to look beautiful all at the same time. Now, how could nerve impulses do such a thing? And in fact, nerve impulses don't travel down a wire. The nervous system is completely discontinuous. Got a little bit here with a synapse.
And what's the synapse meant to do?
Well, it transmits an impulse. We get the impulse supposedly going down the axon, but in fact, when you look at it, it doesn't. You look at the activity, not at your own theory. Look at what actually happens. You've got an axon, which is just the tube from the nerve cell, which is supposed to be carrying an impulse. It doesn't. What happens is that transverse to the axon
Goes at 90 degrees, in other words.
It's 90 degrees to the so-called impulse. Now I'm saying there's no impulse. I'm saying what is happening is the nervous system is transmitting a holographic message saying, a whole 3D picture.
So let's just be really clear about this. Everybody assumes that the nervous system sends an impulse down a wire down here.
Well, there
and
are
actually,
impulses.
and actually, it's just an ionic charge that
It's
goes
like that.
across,
It's
and there's
like-
nothing going down at
It's
all.
a movement of ions. There is an impulse because after this ionic thing happens along the axon, then there's a transmission across the synapse, and it's electrochemical transmission. So there are indeed impulses, but are
But
the
only in the
impulses carrying the...
synapses?
only in the synapses.
And is that possibly just to pass one tiny simple message for it to set up another transverse field in the next bit of nervous
We've got to
system?
set up a special field that's going to carry a special message. And guess what? The nervous system sets up a special field in a special part of the body to carry an impulse. And if it can't go that way, it'll take another route. But the important thing is the creation of a QED field, which I think that's what the nervous system's doing.
So all the nervous system is doing is setting up a field just so it can carry a quantum hologram information on the top.
Looks like it.
Let's just go back again. Also, the nervous system has different diameters all the way through it. So even if it was actually transmitting information, it couldn't possibly be doing it at the same rate. And I think I read somewhere that it actually varies by between 1 and 30 times its speed in different places.
It's worse than that.
Worse
The
than that.
different axons in the body can make the transmission speeds vary from 2 miles an hour to about 200 miles an hour. It's a chaotic system if you look at it as if it's electrical impulses. There are electrical impulses there, you can measure them, all this has been done. But we're saying, as the Chinese say, that is not it.
But I mean, there's also gaps in the myelin, so I mean, it couldn't possibly be an insulator either.
There's something really interesting about the myelin sheath. It's a Schwann cell that wraps around the axon. And most interesting because I thought, well, transmission speeds of the myelinated fibres are far quicker than the unmyelinated ones. And when you get diseases like MS, everything slows down because it's a disintegration of that myelin sheath. Now, from my experiments, I found that the myelin sheath is in fact a field blocker. In other words, it's blocking off other information so that special information can go down the axon. So that is coherent with my theory. I've got very little evidence for it, but that is one important piece.
One potential flaw I saw at that is that if you've got gaps in that myelin sheath, why wouldn't that muck up the transmission of quantum information anyway?
There may be certain places where you get interference patterns between different... we obviously don't understand it at all, but there are obviously sometimes a need for a myelin sheath and sometimes not, depending on what sort of interference patterns coming from close by nerves and so on. It doesn't make much sense at all, but if we radically change the way we look at the nervous system, we can start to understand how we can be ideational creatures and have consciousness and be able to create ideas out of nothing, or seemingly create them out of nothing.
Let's talk a little bit about hemodynamics, or in other words, the dynamics of blood flow, and why, if you've got this ridiculously large blood system going all the way down to your tiny toes and fingers, how on earth can your blood actually be pumped around by your heart and get back to the heart?
Yeah, the problem is really how the blood manages to return to the heart. And of course, people say, well, it's got nowhere else to go, so that's where it goes. That's not very good, because in physics we always look for what's pushing it, what is the motive force. And of course, we've been told that the motive force is the heart, and there's a big problem because the walls of the heart and the internal parts of the heart.
The heart's only this big, isn't it?
Yeah, the muscle wall is only that thick.
And you've got gallons and gallons of blood in you.
Yeah, well, you've got so much pressure, and you've got so many tubes, and you've got so much blood, and the physics of it doesn't add up very well, because you know perfectly well, if you're a farmer, if you have a pump, every pump can only pump up a hill a certain way, and then it just literally stops. So when think of the Chinese idea. Chinese always come up with great ideas. They say that the blood pumps the heart, the other way around. Well, I'm sure that's not the case, but there is a case for looking at the way in which the blood assists it's able to propel itself, as if it were magnetically or something.
Why are you sure it's not actually propelling the heart?
Obviously, the heart is a regulator. Obviously, it pumps it's got enough power to pump a little, but not to explain the whole pumping power it needs. And we're saying maybe the blood does assist it by the blood actually propelling itself through the arteries. And then we look at the walls of the arteries and we find great big long spirals throughout it. And we look at what's in the blood. And
is it possible that arteries are contracting? Like spiralling themselves?
Yeah, it's quite possible. Anything's possible, because nobody has ever looked at the body bioenergetically. A very few people have, and have come up with astounding things, which is what has happened to me. I've come up with some astounding things which seem to work. They seem to work clinically. And so we go back and say, well, surely there's a need to have a look at how the blood could propel itself using the heme. There is a magnetic component of the blood because there's iron there. And the only way we could understand how it propels itself through the arteries and veins is to use some bioenergetic mechanism we don't understand yet.
So if the heart's a regulator, what else might it be doing?
Well, it's a regulator, but bioenergetically its main job is to imprint information onto the fluid, that fluid going to every cell in the body. It's an information imprinter carrying information to the cell. So it means the heart and the blood is one source of information in the body, the nervous system's another.
Why do you need two sources of information in the body?
We've got three, because the third one is the connective tissue. That's the Chinese meridian system. We've got three information systems working concurrently. In case one fails, you've got a backup system.
Oh, so they carry the same information but at different times?
It may not be the same information, but surely they support each other and help each other.
So today we've looked at, going back to the bare bones of reality, how there's some gaps in current biological theory. So we've had a look at temperature control, genetics, information transfer, and the nervous system in more detail. We think that a field explanation gives a much more complete explanation of biology. Thank you for watching.